Myself Sivakrishna. In this video, you would find detailed explanation about RE framework, like how we can move from one state to another state and what are all the activities are available in the each state. Right? So let's get started. So let me open RE framework project in the UiPath Studio. So let's see what are all the variables are available. So a transaction item. So basically this variable will use to store the input details like queue item. So to store the system exception related information, we would use the system exception variable. To store the business exception related information, we would use the business exception variable. The transaction number would be the sequential number. The config variable. This variable is of a dictionary of string comma object type. To store all the config file information, we would use this config variable. The retry number and the consecutive system exception variable will be useful in case of any system exception. So let's see what are all the arguments are available. So in orchestrator queue name and in orchestrator queue folder. So in case you would like to change the queue name and the queue folder name in the runtime, so at the time of starting the process, so you can go to the arguments and we can set these values. In the process, bot will check these arguments and it will replace the queue name and queue folders with the config queue name and folder names, right? So I will show you the logic in the in a bit later. So let's go one by one state and see what are all the activities are available. So in the initialization, basically we can have two transitions, system exception and successful, and these transactions are based on the system exception variable. So if the system exception variable is nothing, that means that it is a successful, then it will go to the get transaction data. If the system exception variable is not nothing, then it will go to the end process. Let's go inside the initialization, then see what are the activities are available. So the first step would be the setting the system exception variable as nothing. Then we would check the config is nothing. Obviously when we are starting the process, the config variable is nothing. Then it will go inside the block and it will fetch the configuration file details. So when you go inside this block, we can have one log message. So in this log message, we would get the screen resolution. So to get the screen resolution, this is the expression, and then we have one invoke init all settings. So in this workflow, we would read all the configuration file details and we would go into store in the config variable. So let's see what are all the arguments are available here. So here we can have a config file. So we would need to mention the complete file location and the config sheets. So basically here we should mention what are all the sheets available in the config file. If you want to add more sheets, so we can add in the config file, then the sheet names we should mention here. So from this workflow, we can have one output argument that would be the config, and it is a dictionary of string comma object. So let's close this and open the workflow and see the logic. So the first step, we are logging one message and then we are initializing the object. So to initializing the object, we have this expression new dictionary of string comma object. Then the sheets are in the string of array format, so we are iterating all the sheets. Then we are reading one by one sheet and adding the details to the dictionary in the form of key and value pair. So we are iterating the sheets and then we are reading the sheet based on the config file location and the sheet name and storing the details into the data table. Then we are iterating the data table and then we are checking the name field is empty or not. If it is empty, then we are not going to add those details to the config file. If it is not empty, then we are going to add the details to the config variable. So here the name would be the key value and the value would be the value column value, right? So after completion of iterating all the sheets, then we would go to the read the asset sheet, then we will going to store in the data table, then we are going to iterate the asset data table, and then we're going to fetch the details. We're going to fetch the orchestrator asset details and we're going to store in the asset value. So here we are going to store the name as a key value and the asset value would be the value in the config variable. So in case of any exception while reading the config file or fetching the details, so here we can throw the exception with exception details, right? Let's move to the main. So after that we need bot will check the in arguments is not empty. If it is not empty, then we would replace this in argument value with the config file. So in this case, here we can have two input arguments, that is the in orchestrator queue name and in orchestrator queue folder. So first we are checking the in orchestrator queue name. If it is not empty, then it will replace the queue name in the config file with the in argument. The same thing for the UiPath orchestrator queue folder. So if it is not empty, then it will replace the folder name with config file. Then we have a invoke kill process workflow. Here we can apply the logic to kill the applications like any Windows applications or browsers. So here we can add the kill processes and we can mention the relevant names. Then we have one add log fields activity. Here we can mention the process name. So let me show you some details about the add log fields. Basically here when you log into the message, we can have some details, right? So by default we can have a message, level, log type, and the remaining are default values. If you would like to add more details, so we can use this add log field. So in this case I have added one process name field, and then I have added two more fields, process name, name, and date. So immediate after that I have removed these two values, date and name, but I haven't removed this process name. So until we remove this log field, this value would be continue to the entire our project. So that is the main thing here. So after that it will check the maximum consecutive exceptions. So to check this is the expression. So in the config file basically we can have a maximum consecutive system exception. We will set with some number to retry in case of any system exceptions, right? So if it is reaches maximum consecutive exception, so bot will throw an exception. So bot will go to the end state. The next step would be the calling the init all application workflow. Here we can initialize application that we are working, or initialize the database connection if you are working with any database, right? So after that bot will check this system exception variable whether it is empty or not. So if you go inside these transitions, then here we can have condition system exception is nothing. If it is nothing, then it will go to the get transaction data. If system exception is not nothing, then it will go to the end process. So let's move to the get transaction data. So here we can have two transitions, one is no data and another one is new transaction. So these transitions are on the basis of transaction item. If the transaction item is nothing, that means we don't have any transaction to process, so it will go to the end process. If the transaction status is nothing, is not nothing, that means we have a transaction to process, so it will go to the process transaction. So before going to the get transaction data, I would like to show you stop and start. So stop and start, we can have a transaction, and start and start, we can have any transaction. So if it is nothing, then it will go to the process transaction. So before going to the get transaction data, I would like to show you stop and start. So stop and start, we can have a transaction, and start and start, we can have any transaction. So if it is nothing, then it will go to the process transaction. So kill options when you are running the process, right? So here we can have a kill and stop. So these options will be enabled when the process is running. So if you kill, if you select the kill, the process will terminate immediately. If you click on stop, the orchestrator will send a signal to the process. So we need to check that signal, and then accordingly we should stop the process. So I will show you how what is the logic to catch this signal, and how we can stop the process. Let's move to the UiPath Studio, then go inside the get transaction data. So this is the stop signal. So basically this is the should stop activity. So it will catch the UiPath orchestrator stop signal. So it will return the boolean value. So here we are checking if it is true, then we are logging the message, then we are making the transaction item as nothing. So if you are not receiving this signal, then we'll go inside this get transaction data and we'll fetch the new transactions, right? So here we can have one log message get the transaction item, then you would get the new transaction by using the get transaction item. So by using the queue folder and the queue name, and the data will be stored in the transaction item. In case of any exception while fetching the details, then we will log the message, then we will read through the exception. Alright, then this exception detail will be catched in this exception. So here we can log one message, and then we will making the the transaction item variable as nothing, right? So basically if in the get transaction item, the transaction item is nothing is happening in the three scenarios: whether we are receiving the stop signal in the UiPath orchestrator, or issue in fetching the details from the UiPath orchestrator queue, or we don't have any new transaction to process, right? So the process transaction, so here we can have three type of transactions. One is successful, another one is business exception, and third one would be the system exception. So these transitions on the basis of system exception variable and business exception variable, right? So here in the process transaction, initially we set business exception as nothing. So in the process workflow, we would apply the business logic. In case of input data is not in the expected format, or it is not met the business requirement, so we would throw the business exception, right? So it will catch the details in the business exception, and in case of any system exception, these details will come in this catch system exception block, right? Then accordingly we need to set the transaction status. So let's go inside the set transaction status and see the logic. So here we need to check whether the business exception is nothing and system exception is nothing. That means a transaction is successful. And if the business exception is not nothing, means that is the business exception, and the last one is the system exception. If you go inside the success, then we should first we need to check that the transaction type is queue item or not. So if it is queue type, then it will go inside this block, then it will update the transaction status as successful, right? In case of any exception by setting this transaction status, it will log the message and it will throw the exception, right? Then it will add a few transaction log fields, like these are the some status number and ID field 1, field 2. So we will log one message, then immediately we will remove these log fields. So after that it will increment the values, transaction number value, and making the retry number 0 and consecutive exception to 0. For the business exception also the same thing. First we need to check that the transaction type is queue type or not. So if it is queue type, then it will update the status to a fail, and we will mention the reason. In case of any exception while setting the transaction status, we would log the message and rethrow the exception, right? Then again here we are adding the log fields and then logging the message and removing the same transaction log fields. So the final step would be the system exception. So here we will first log the consecutive system exception count, and then here in the assign query retry, we will check if the transaction is of a queue type or not. So this queue retry will give boolean value. So in case of any system exception, bot will take the screenshot and will store in the exception folder path that we mentioned in the config file. And then in case of any exception, bot will take the exception details. And the next step would be, so if it is a queue type transaction, then bot will go inside and set the transaction status, and then it will take the retry number for the queue. So to get the retry count, this is the expression transaction item dot retry number. So in case of any exception while setting the status, so bot will take the exception details and it will rethrow. Then bot will apply the retry mechanism. So yeah, before applying the retry mechanism, bot will add the transaction details, and then it will increment the consecutive system exception by 1, and then bot will apply the retry current transaction logic. So here in the in the config file, we can have a max retry number. So if you are using the queue transaction type, it should be better, we should set to 0, but if you are not using, we can set this value. So here bot will check maximum retry number is greater than 1. If it is false, bot will apply the retry mechanism in the UiPath orchestrator queue. So if you have some value in the max retry number, then it will check it is reached a maximum retry count or not. If it is not reaches, then bot will check whether it is a queue type transaction or non queue type. If it is queue type, then it will increment the transaction number by 1, and then if it is non queue type, then it will increment the retry number. Then if it is reaches maximum retry number, then it will log the message, and then it will set the retry number to 0, and then it will increment the transaction number, right? After that, bot will close the applications, like sign out from the applications. In case of any exception while sign out in the application, bot will log the details, and then it will kill the applications. Even in the kill application, if you found any exception, bot will log the exception details, right? For system exceptions, bot will go to the initialization, then here it will check a maximum consecutive exception reached or not. If it is not reaches, then bot will reopen the applications and it will process. And if it is reaches maximum consecutive exceptions, so it will throw the exception and it will move to the end process. So in the end process, we will close the applications, and in case of any exception while closing the application, bot will log the exception details and it will kill the process. So this is all about the detailed explanation about the RE framework. Hope this video is informative. Thanks for watching this video, and have a nice day.